So now I'm going to speak about motherhood and power. Orishabiya Osi Yalabasin. There's no deity like the mother. Mothers are the ones that we ought to worship. It's widely posited that motherhood is important in all of Africa's societies or communities. Of course, the requirement is that all women ought to be mothers. Of course, the requirement that all women ought to be mothers may also operate in an oppressive manner to discipline those who are not able to bear children or who do not want to bear children. I want to start with the ideal. Ideally, what are the powers, privileges, and entitlements that motherhood gives a woman? The Yoruba say, Yanewura Babanijigi. Mother is gold, father is a mirror. Mother is gold that is strong, valuable, true, central to a child's existence. Wise, also self-denying. As a mother, Ikunle Abiyamo, the kneeling position that is assumed at the moment of birth, confers privileges on a mother. Ideally, mothers ought to be respected, ought to be heeded, ought to be able to ask their offspring to transcend the limits of doing just enough. Mothers also ought to be respected by society at large. The very act of childbirth is, to say the very least, one of the most difficult things that a human being can do in life. Prior to this, a mother carries the child in utero for 9 months, and subsequently nurtures the child, guaranteeing not only physical survival, but moral development and the development of a social conscience. Among the Yoruba, motherhood confers privileges that hark back to the very foundations of society and women's presumed roles in it. Women symbolize fertility, fecundity, fruitfulness. Women are also feared. They are believed to be capable of deploying, even of having the capacity to unleash powerful forces of darkness. Those who have studied the rituals associated with Gelede ritual performances among the Egbadu and Igbomina, people who are Yorubas, demonstrate the underpinning of female power and the visible demonstration of the power of women for both good and evil, the power to create and destroy, to critique social behavior, and to use the power of satire to check transgressors. Gelede is a display of the power of women to create new life and to undermine the very essence of society, if not properly worshipped. This is according to Lawal. A similar portrayal of women's power in the spiritual realm is observable in Ifa, in the worship of Yemoja, Oya, Oshun, all very powerful female deities. They're referred to as Iya by all their worshippers and devotees who are both men and women. These deities are also ministered to by both men and women. Priests and priestesses who are fully initiated into the service of this Orisha are referred to as the Iyawo prior to gaining the full stature of priest. When male Yoruba priests are in this final preparatory stage, they dress in women's clothing, a factor that has generated the observation among some scholars that this entails cross-dressing. Moreover, the donning of women's clothing by such priests is regarded as a mark of transvestitism by Joel and Matori, Westcott, and Morton Williams. For example, as Aya or Iyawo, wives who marry into an Idile patrilineage and have patrilocal residence in an Agboile family compound. Yoruba women are essentially the outsiders within the Ebi or the family. One side of the equation that most analysts and scholars fail to consider is that a male that marries into an Idile does not have superior rights within that Idile to the women in the Idile. As outsiders, they only participate in decision-making through the agency of their wives, who are part of the Idile. There are also social obligations that men who are outsiders to the Idile by virtue of being married into it must perform. To concentrate our attention on women, being an Iyawo is the site where women's biological reality of being sexually and anatomically female conjoins with the social reality of being women. And thus, they are less powerful than males as Iyawo. As Iyawo, a woman who marries into the Idile has a lower status than the Oko. The Oko, in this case, are male and female members of the Idile into which the woman marries. They are members of the Ebi. And the status here of the Oko pays no attention to the anatomical maleness or femaleness, but it privileges membership in the Idile. This is why all the descendants of the Idile have superior rights to those who marry into it. All Iyawo's labor can be demanded by their husbands, including all members of the patrilineage, and it is expected to be graciously given. Iyawo also occupy a lower status, a fact that is demonstrated by the deference shown to Oko, all members of the patrilineage into which they marry. Due to the erasure of the philosophical underpinnings of Yoruba's social practices that has occurred over time, it's necessary to explain to many educated Yoruba that the reason why mothers call their male and female children Oko is an indicator of the mother's outsider status and an affirmation of the children's insider position vis-a-vis their own mother in the family. Despite the intrusion of new principles and institutions over time, such relationships can be observed in contemporary Yoruba families. When women act as Oko within the Idile, they're often presented by scholarly observers as examples of women's inhumanity to women. For example, we see this in Kokori Vidrovich's 1996 publication. Among Iyawo, the first wife is more powerful than others by virtue of being the first comer into the family, and thus having seniority vis-a-vis other Iyawo within the family. Of course, since no family is immune to the effects of politics, there are cases in which the favorite wife threatens the supremacy of the first wife. Wives have also been known to cooperatively challenge an unjust occur, whether spouse or the members of the idili. What is clear in the relations among women is that one cannot make an ad hoc assumption about the commonality of the female experience. So women as occur, as members of an idili into which other women marry, the women are regarded as the occur or the husbands, and thus have a great deal of power. They're entitled to the norms of by the norms of the Yoruba society to demand and expect the labor of the wives of the family. In return, they're expected to comport themselves with dignity and to lawo or be open-handed or generous towards their yawo. The categorization of women as members of an idili, women members of an idili as oko, is not to be taken as indicating any sexual relations with the yawo. Instead, it indicates that Yoruba societies do not have the same gendering imperatives that one finds in the West. Unfortunately, since most scholars of Africa have the tendency to adopt Western categories as given, and since they apply these categories without inquiring into whether they fit, Western-style gender categorizations have become de rigueur in African scholarship. So now for women's religious and ritual powers. As deities and ritual leaders, there is no gendered difference. There are no gender differences in the social experiences of men and women. Many Yoruba deities combine male and female properties and qualities. There are even examples of one and the same deity being designated male in certain locales within Yoruba land and as females in others, according to Ido, 1962. Oya, one of the principal deities of the Yoruba, for whom the river Niger is named. It's called Odoya by the Yoruba. Oya is reputed to have been one of the wives of Shango, the fourth monarch of the Yoruba. Her symbols are two naked swords and buffalo horns. For Johnson in 1997, I'm quoting, as thunder and lightning are attributed to Shango, so tornado and violent thunderstorms are rending trees and leveling high towers and houses are attributed to Oya. They signify her displeasure. These are not female characteristics in a gendered world that sees women as kind, gentle, nurturing, and docile. Within the Yoruba philosophy of life, there is nothing intrinsically male and female. An anatomical male can be both gentle and ruthless, and so can an anatomical female. What matters more is for such qualities to be deployed appropriately. So now, women as political officials. Political power is not limited to men within Yoruba society. Yoruba princesses can marry commoners who may then be conferred with titles, including obaship, as Johnson claims is the case of the Olowu, son of the firstborn of Oduduwa, a princess, and her father's Alawo, a priest. There are still contemporary examples of female Ijoye or chiefs. Iyalode, Erelu, Yeyoba are just a few of such female positions. Today, as with the obaships, these positions are denuded of power, being only ceremonial vestiges of their pre-colonial manifestations, that they remain and that the holders attract the respect and admiration of the public is an indicator of the persistence of norms and values that do not conform with a Western delimited understanding of gender. The Oyo Empire and other Yoruba states show us evidence of the institutionalization of women's political power into centralized political realms in a manner that demonstrates that anatomical and biological femaleness was not considered coterminous with a disadvantaged gender. Social status and power was multiply determined, and whether an individual exercised power depended on scope and domain. As Iyalode, we have the examples of Efunshetan Aniwura of Ibadan and Madame Tinubu of Abeokuta. As powerful women of their times who exercised the power which their office was endowed, with which their office was endowed. And in the case of Efunshetan Aniwura, they were not averse from engaging in power struggle and participating actively in war, albeit through surrogates, as did many of their male counterparts. In the Oyo Empire, the Ilari, who were variously regarded as the keepers of the king's head or his bodyguard, were both male and female. According to Johnson, every male Ilari has a female counterpart who is called his companion. The Ilaris themselves, by courtesy, call them their mother. They're both created at one and the same time, and they're supposed to seek each other's interests. Although there must be no intimacy between them, the female Ilaris being the denizens of the king's harem, the only attention they're allowed to pay each other is to make exchange of presents at the yearly festivals, unquote. In addition, Johnson also identified ladies of the palace, who included 8 titled ladies, 8 priestesses, other ladies of rank, and ayaba, or the king's wives. As residents of the palace, all the women were termed ayaba, which is no indication of their being married to him. As indicated by Johnson, the highest ranked women are listed in order of importance as follows: Iya Oba, Iya Kere, Iya Noso, Iya Monori, Iya Afinku, Iya Lagbon, Iya Lagbon, Orunkumefun, Are Orite. As the king's official mother, Iya Oba acted the part of a mother and was empowered to jointly worship with the Oba and Bashorun every September. According to Johnson, quote, she's the feudal head of the Bashorun. Great deference is due of the Iyaoba, but the Iyakere wields more power within the palace, being in charge of the royal treasury, as well as the royal insignia and all paraphernalia used on state occasions. Being in control meant that she could prevent any state ceremony when the Oba incurred her wrath. She was also the official mother of all Ilari, be they male or female. In recognition of her motherhood, they were created in her quarters. Iyakere was also the feudal head of Iseyin, Iwo, and Ogbomosho, 3 Yoruba towns. Among the Ijebu, women are members of the Oshogbo, the same institution as the Egba Ogboni, of which women are also members. In the pre-colonial era, this institution served the functions of schooling members in oratory and jurisprudence. It also functioned as the National Court of Appeals. It had jurisdiction over criminal cases and was mandated to execute those convicted where warranted. The Ogboni House was also used as a state prison when necessary. Most importantly, the institution was mandated to prevent monarchical absolutism as well as mass lawlessness, according to Alayande. In the new Oyo Empire, a female official of the Ogboni represented the Alaafin and reported back to him on the council's deliberations. The institutional function of the Ogboni included serving as a check against the abuse of power by the Oyomesi, the Council of Chiefs. The institution of Iyalode has replaced the important institutionalized women's political positions of the pre-colonial era. Among the Ijebu, the Erelu serves in the same capacity. Although today's Iyalode still have a great deal of power, particularly in the sphere of exchange and commerce, where market administration and adjudication are their purview. And even though we know of the famous Iyalode of Europe, like Efunsheto Aniwura of Ibadan and Madame Tinubu of Abeokuta, this position too is denuded of much of the formal powers that it had in the past. Today, the Iyalode is the title that denotes seniority among the female political officials in some Yoruba indigenous governance systems. In Lagos, the Iyalode remains an important official, being subordinate in standing only to the Oba of Lagos. The Iyalode also participates actively in the appointment and installation of the Oba. Among the Ondo, women have a hierarchical line of chiefs that parallel men's chiefships. Oyewumi's research also draws on evidence of woman monarchs among Oyo Yoruba, some of which is presented in Samuel Johnson. So now let me turn to women as owners of capital and controllers of economic power. Yoruba women have gained more recognition as holders, controllers, and wielders of economic power than for any other kind of power that they exercise. Many studies point to the active participation and contribution of Yoruba women in the economy, but also accurately decry the lack of recognition by post-colonial Nigerian governments for this contribution. For example, we see this in Awe's work. Curiously, active participation in the economy has also not been successfully parlayed into post-colonial political power. We see also Professor Awe saying this. The same assessment can be made of women's experiences throughout Africa, which ought to be translated into a realization of the depth of the success of the colonial project. A homogenized existence that doesn't reflect the pre-colonial realities now runs rampant because there is no observable difference between one African country and others. This is in spite of South Africa's appointment of many women into political positions and the election of many female legislators. What is needed is not necessarily just more women in power, but having many women in power who have a deep understanding of the needs, goals, and objectives of women, as multiple as this may be, given differences in their class and regional interests. This is a difficult but not impossible agenda that will still continue to challenge us in the future. So let me conclude. When viewed from the perspective of scholarly works on gender, we see that the gendering of society may in and of itself render women as mothers not only powerless, but as marginal to social, political, and economic life. The burdens of motherhood may be so heavy that a woman is never able to develop a sense of herself. She's most likely to be impoverished, most likely to be irrelevant, constantly reminded that women are the weaker sex. Wars affect them more. Economic crises prostrate them. They are the epitome of wretchedness. Statistics are deployed to confirm the reality of these depictions. I am not denying that these women are burdened. I am not contesting the existence of patriarchy. I'm not saying that there are no instances of gender-based oppressions in contemporary Yoruba society. What I claim, the assumption that will support this work in progress, is that women in African society exercise power in multiple ways that are difficult to acknowledge or recognize when we use the tools that are designed to study Western societies. In order to properly study African societies, we have to, as an initial condition, consider the reality that stares us in the face. African societies are different. We can learn valuable lessons on the human condition if we take them seriously. Gender is not deployed in the same way in African societies as it is in the West. There are multiple conditions that we cannot explain with the tools of Western scholarship. I contend that if we really understand Yoruba culture, we'll find a way of conveying meaning to what is observed in a manner that does what Yai refers to as the task of Benu, that is orator or verbal carver or critic, who continues the Beno or carver's job after the latter has completed carving a piece. The Benu as the orator, the one that carves language with the mouth in presenting the verbal gloss on the work of the sculptor, must understand and successfully convey the meaning of concepts in a manner that captures both the spirit and the letter of the philosophical intent of the people in whose culture a practice is grounded. Most Africanists neglect to be worthwhile gbenu when they invent out of whole cloth the relevance of practices that they only understand within the scope of Western ideological systems of thought. Unfortunately, the desire to hybridize, to be cosmopolitan, to be global leads African scholars into the pitfall of taking these Western glosses as gospel and contributing to their dissemination in a highly unconscious, unreflecting manner. Further, if we contrast the cross-dressing claim with the fact that when Catholic and Protestant priests wear robes, they are not considered as cross-dressing. In addition, when Catholic priests become, quote, the brides of Christ at the final moment of their initiation, and they are given rings that symbolize this relationship, it is not cast as transvestitism. Why then use such characterization to describe Yoruba ritual? In large part, this is due to scholars' use of concepts that are meaningful in the context of their own social and historical experience. To some degree, it is also due to a lack of genuine and deep understanding of philosophical underpinnings of external phenomena. Another very important factor to realize is that if we accept that contemporary women are commonly oppressed by patriarchy, the agency that is primarily really responsible is the state. The contemporary state was not created by Africans. It is a colonial imposition. Being so imposed, it bore, to paraphrase Amina Mama, the racial hierarchy and gender politics of 19th century Europe, as a result of which Africa was, quote, indoctrinated into all male administrative systems and the insidious paternalism of the new religious and educational systems, unquote. This, quote, has persistently affected all aspects of social, cultural, political, and economic life in post-colonial African states, unquote. Now, hearkening back to Yai, what are the false issues? What are the non-issues? Which are the extraneous notions and concepts that might be or are smuggled into the studies of African women in the 21st century? Is the identification of such issues, notions, and concepts counterproductive to the development of an international women's movement? When Yai talks about the duties of the Gbenu as complementing the Gbenu, his injunctions ought to be taken to heart. Not to do so is to directly embrace the perils of cosmopolitanism and hybridization. The consequences for African gender scholars are dire and calamitous, since they portend ruthlessness, disjointedness, and profound loss of autonomy. Although my focus in this essay is on gender studies, the problems are not limited to this area, but apply to all disciplines under the rubric of African studies. If we do not maintain constant vigilance against unwarranted cosmopolitanism and ruthless hybridization, What results is a profound lack of self-determination from the level of the individual scholar up to the level of the nation. Thus, we find examples of scholars and entire countries that take up the theories, concepts, and solutions that were designed to explain and solve problems in other places with historically distinct legacies and embrace them wholesale and without much critical examination. Under the lens of these theories and concepts, everything African begins to look absurd and pathological. Under the influence of the imported solutions, African states and societies reel from one botched remedy to the next. Cosmopolitan and hybridized scholars then turn on the powerful imported lenses once again to proclaim that tradition is the problem. Instead, I call for a rethinking of the terms of Africa's ideological, cultural, economic, and political engagement with the hegemonic powers of the contemporary global system. As the traditionalized author, the most thoughtful response is to problematize tradition and emphasize its dynamism and complexity as a concept that describes not just something stuck in the dim, inaccessible past, but processes that are constantly being defined, reshaped, reformed, and rekindled. When these processes occur, tradition is transformed over and again. The assumption that tradition is irrevocably wedded to the past is wrong. The assumption that African tradition is a priori the zone of women's marginalization and oppression should be interrogated rather than accepted as a given. The opposite assumption that modernity is the zone of liberation also must be unpacked. That women had the opportunity to participate in the public sphere and wield power within the family prior to Africa's colonization is to say that such zones of power should be considered as opening up the possibility that arguments and struggles for African women's inclusion in the public sphere and in the exercise of power within the family do not have to be based on imported ideologies. Secondly, modernity is not an unproblematic phenomenon. It could either be oppressive or liberating. It could marginalize as well as centralize. Participation in the global system could be made more possible or made easier through the mediating power of traditions that validate, empower, and celebrate, centralize the African women. The duty of the scholars Beno Beno and Benu Ben is to use the right tools to create the right meaning and accurate interpretation. What ought to be done is to improve the lot of immigrant African women. What ought to be done to improve the lot of immigrant African women in Western labor markets? First, there must be the acknowledgement that women are both similar and different. Race, class, and ethnicity, as well as other aspects of a woman's identity, including sexual preference or orientation, insert differences and provide possibilities for the assertion of sameness based on common socioeconomic locations. The differences need not preclude the formation of coalitions. And sameness must not be assumed as making automatic unity for common purposive action possible. Instead, organizing must be done to build coalitions that cross national, class, gender, race, ethnic, and other boundaries. One of the most important coalitions should be that between organized labor and immigrant African women workers, most of whom are undocumented and thus far non-unionized. Many of these women left their home countries by any means necessary to participate in the New World Order's global system. For better or worse, they are participating in a new global economy described by Naomi Klein as one where the division, and I begin the quote, between fortress continents and locked out continents. For locked out continents, even their cheap labor isn't needed, and their countries are left to beg outside the gate for a half-decent price for wheat and bananas. Inside the fortress countries, a new social hierarchy has been engineered to reconcile the seemingly contradictory political priorities of the post-September 11 era. How do you have airtight borders and still maintain access to cheap labor? How do you expand for trade and still pander to the anti-immigrant vote? How do you stay open to business and stay close to people? Easy. First, you expand the perimeter, then you lock down. Okay, fortresses can, and this is the end of the quote, and I say fortresses can only exist if those enclosed within them are complicit in their maintenance. There are sections of labor that are probably more vulnerable to exploitation by capital because of downsizing and outright relocation of industrial plants to regions of the world where labor is cheap and docile and costs low. These vulnerable workers probably see immigrant workers as threats because they are liable to take just about any wages and conditions that are offered in household employment and the service economy. African immigrants themselves need to act. They must build trans-ethnic and transnational mutual assistance associations that collaborate to give advice, advocate for the recognition of rights, and seek strategic alliances with progressive labor unions to ensure the protection of their clients. These associations are necessary because even while immigrants may be entitled to some benefits, they may be too afraid to apply for them for fear of running afoul of immigration and naturalization authorities, and therefore facing deportation. Thank you very much.